For more than a century and a half, the question of what Neanderthals were has remained unsettled, not because the evidence is thin, but because it refuses to behave the way categories prefer. The traditional account presents them as a separate species, a side branch of humanity that briefly overlapped with our own before fading away. Yet, when the evidence is laid out carefully, when genetics, reproduction, and fossil variation are allowed to speak together rather than in isolation, that story begins to feel less like a conclusion and more like a decision made in advance. Boundaries that were once drawn confidently start to soften. Traits that were treated as diagnostic become tendencies rather than rules. And the idea that Neanderthals were almost human, but not quite, begins to lose its footing. What emerges instead is a picture of deep biological compatibility, not occasional contact between strangers, but sustained interaction between populations that were never fully apart. This is not a sentimental claim, it is a biological one. When categories fail to describe reality, science does not defend the category, it revises it. The discomfort surrounding Neanderthals begins here, in the growing recognition that the separation may never have been as clean as we were taught to believe. Genetics forces the question into sharper focus. Neanderthal DNA is not a rare trace, not an accident frozen in our genomes. It is a persistent layer carried by billions of living people today. That persistence matters. It tells us that hybrid offspring were not only possible, but viable, integrated, and repeatedly absorbed into expanding human populations across time and geography. This is not how fully separate mammalian species behave. Where species boundaries are firm, hybrids tend to be fragile or sterile, and their genetic signatures disappear quickly. What we see instead is long-term gene flow, shaped by selection but never erased. Some variants faded, others remained neutral. A few proved useful. That pattern is familiar to population genetics. It is not a signature of isolation. Even deeper, Neanderthals shared fundamental physiological systems with us. Blood group variants, immune responses, and reproductive compatibility all point toward a shared biological framework. These are not superficial similarities. They are systems that operate only when organisms inhabit the same biological world. At this level, the word species begins to feel less explanatory and more restrictive. Anatomy has long been used to defend the divide, yet anatomy itself refuses to cooperate. Fossil humans do not arrange themselves into clean boxes. Early members of our own lineage appear heavy, robust, and unfamiliar by modern standards. Transport a group of Homo sapiens from 100,000 years ago into a modern classroom and they would not resemble recent Europeans. They would look archaic, and yet they remain Homo sapiens without controversy. This inconsistency matters. The same anatomical range tolerated within our species becomes evidence of separateness when applied to Neanderthals. Cranial shape, pelvic proportions, and facial structure are treated as boundaries rather than variables. But fossils tell a different story. Variation spreads across time and space. Traits overlap. Contact zones blur the edges. In regions where populations met repeatedly, anatomy forms gradients, not fences. That pattern is expected when groups diverge locally and reconnect through gene flow. Species boundaries do not normally behave this way unless the classification itself is being forced onto a reality that resists it. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Levant, a corridor where human populations passed, paused, and returned for tens of thousands of years. Fossils from this region complicate every simple narrative. Individuals classified as Neanderthals display traits often described as modern. Others labeled as Homo sapiens retain archaic features. The anatomy interpenetrates, creating profiles that refuse caricature. Consider individuals who were tall rather than squat, whose cranial capacity exceeded modern averages, whose overall build does not align with the stereotype of a cold, adapted brute. These fossils are not anomalies. They are signals. They indicate long-standing interaction rather than isolation, continuity rather than replacement. Classic Neanderthal traits, robust limbs, facial projection, broad noses, can be shaped by climate and environment as much as ancestry. Human anatomy responds to temperature, mobility, and energy demands. Pelvic shape varies even today across populations and sexes. To turn any single feature into a species barcode is to mistake tendency for law. Culture is often dismissed as irrelevant to species classification, yet in humans, that dismissal is selective. Behavioral modernity is routinely used to identify Homo sapiens in the archaeological record when bones are absent. Symbolic behavior, ornamentation, burial practices, and long-distance exchange matter deeply when defining our own lineage. Culture is treated as essential until it threatens an established boundary. This is not neutrality, it is strategy. Human biology evolved for culture. Our extended childhoods, social cognition, and vocal anatomy reflect that. Culture is not an accessory. It is an adaptive system through which humans survive. To exclude it only when Neanderthals demonstrate it is to protect a conclusion rather than test it. Neanderthals mastered fire, built shelters, navigated harsh climates, and maintained regional traditions for tens of thousands of years. They cared for the injured and buried their dead. These behaviors do not prove identity on their own, but neither can they be erased when inconvenient. In human evolution, biology and culture are inseparable. Once genetics, anatomy, and behavior are allowed to remain in the same conversation, the image that emerges is not one of replacement, but of entanglement. Human populations across Eurasia did not move like clean waves, erasing what came before. They moved unevenly, pausing, fragmenting, reconnecting. Isolation occurred, but it was rarely permanent. Contact returned again and again. This pattern explains why Neanderthal traits appear within early Homo sapiens contexts and why sapiens traits surface within Neanderthal populations. Hybridization produces exactly this effect. It softens distinctions, redistributes variation, and creates mosaics rather than categories. Over time, those mosaics become the fossil record itself. Seen this way, Neanderthals do not resemble an extinct species sealed off for hundreds of thousands of years. They resemble a regional human population shaped by long continuity in cold Eurasian environments, interacting intermittently with neighboring groups who carry different adaptations. The record reads like population history, not species replacement. The idea of total replacement depends on a sharp break, a moment when one form of humanity vanishes and another takes its place. Yet no such break appears clearly in either genetics or archaeology. Instead, we see persistence, we see inheritance, we see absorption rather than erasure. Some Neanderthal genetic variants declined over time, likely because they were mismatched to new demographic conditions. Others endured, a few even spread. This is not unusual. When populations merge, selection does not judge ancestry, only consequence. Genes that work remain, those that do not fade. Importantly, the scale of genetic distance matters. The gap between Neanderthals and recent humans is small compared to that separating truly distinct mammalian species. Their compatibility was not marginal. It was sufficient to leave lasting biological consequences. At that point, insisting on a strict species divide becomes less an observation and more an insistence. What makes this debate uniquely difficult is that humans are not like most organisms used to define species boundaries. Our survival does not depend solely on anatomy. It depends on knowledge transmitted across generations. Fire use, clothing, shelter construction, food processing, and cooperative care reshape selective pressures themselves. Neanderthals lived within this same framework. They adapted culturally as well as biologically. They exploited diverse environments, from forests to coasts, from open plains to mountainous terrain. Their technological traditions persisted for tens of thousands of years, which is not the mark of a cognitively marginal population. Once culture is acknowledged as part of human biology, the exclusion becomes harder to justify. Culture does not float above the organism. It is produced by brains shaped for learning, memory, and shared meaning. To treat it as irrelevant is to misunderstand what kind of organism a human is. By this point, the question subtly changes. It is no longer whether Neanderthals were different. They clearly were. The question becomes whether difference alone defines species. In many animals, it might. In humans, difference has always existed within continuity. Early Homo sapiens were not modern in the way living humans are modern. They were transitional. That admission already undermines any attempt to use modern anatomy or behavior as a hard boundary. If humanity itself is a moving target through time, then static categories lose their authority. Neanderthals occupy a place within that movement. They represent one expression of humanity shaped by geography, climate, and deep time. When the evidence is read without forcing it into inherited boxes, what appears is not an evolutionary dead end, but a branch that merged back into the larger stream. In the end, this debate is not only about classification, it is about narrative. It is about who is allowed inside the story of humanity and who is kept just outside it. For decades, the language of separation felt comfortable. It preserved a clean origin story, but comfort is not evidence. Neanderthals were not the other. They were humans we encountered, interacted with, learned from, and absorbed as our populations expanded. Their genes persist. Their adaptations shaped later success. Their lives unfolded within the same fragile balance of environment, cooperation, and survival that defines all human history. If this story resonates with you, consider it not as revision, but as recovery. By re-examining the past carefully, we preserve the memory of real lives rather than simplified categories. You are invited to mark that preservation by staying with this work, by returning to it, and by sharing stories from your own family history of movement, labor, endurance, and adaptation across generations.